Good afternoon, everyone. Josh's Severe Weather. Happy Sunday to you. We continue to track Milton, which is nearing hurricane strength and may already be at that point across the southwestern Gulf of Mexico. And the storm continues to overachieve, and we are going to see some very severe impacts when it eventually makes landfall in Florida sometime between Wednesday afternoon and Thursday morning. Unfortunately, I do believe that this storm has what should be a really good spot where it can extremely intensify very quickly from tropical storm to Category 5 in a matter of a couple of days. It's a small storm. It's in a very favorable spot with very low wind shear across the southern Gulf, and it is going to be avoiding land. I don't think it's going to hit that strong in Florida, but it will be growing in size as it does approach the west coast of Florida. And this is the time now when you need to be watching very closely as forecasts begin to get more confident, and we're starting to see some agreement in the track. There's been a little bit of a shift south today. Yesterday, there was a shift north with the official track taking it just south of Tampa Bay, maybe towards Bradenton and Sarasota. But I don't want you to get extremely caught up in that track because it could still go back and forth a little bit in either direction. And we're not really going to know exactly where it's going to hit until almost too close to that event to do anything about it. So this is could be one of our strongest storms of the season outside of Beryl. We also have two other storms, Kirk and Leslie, which are no threat to land, and something else that could develop towards the Cape Verde Islands and become Tropical Storm Nadine. But we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. I'm going to focus the majority of this video on Milton, which you can see is very healthy looking with a core forming here in the southwestern Gulf. We do have low pressure that came out of the Caribbean and over Mexico that is moving through Florida, providing kind of a preview rainfall event. This is going to get the ground nice and saturated before Hurricane Milton comes in this direction and up in this direction here. And fortunately for us here, Kirk is no longer going to be a strong storm. It will be weakening significantly over cooler waters, but will provide some impacts to Western Europe early next week. Hurricane Leslie at this point is fighting off some wind shear, but is expected to start to weaken as it follows Kirk, kind of in the same general direction. In the Pacific, we've got a disturbance that we're watching, but it is probably going to come to the northwest and move away from mainland Mexico, but might impact you in the Cabo area here, Cabo Sur. Elsewhere, we do have a strong front moving through the Great Lakes region. Expect some severe weather this afternoon and tonight over parts of the upper Ohio Valley, the eastern Great Lakes, Lake Erie area in particular. This is a strong front that's moving south and east. And fortunately, that front is going to block the northern Gulf Coast and provide dry air on the northwest side of the system and keep it from coming northward. But it is not going to make it far enough south to protect the Florida Peninsula. So it only is going to get so far here as we are in the beginning of October. You can see here a very well-defined circulation and a very small system, but intense in the middle as Milton is on its way to becoming a hurricane this afternoon. Here's our other circulation, by the way. It is being sheared by the approaching front in here, and that is producing some heavy rain across southwest Florida and even into southeast Florida this afternoon, and more bands of heavy rain will be spreading onto the Keys this afternoon and into southwest Florida later today. But that is going to escape ahead of Milton and not impact Milton's strength or circulation size at this point. This morning, our first aircraft got down into Milton. It took some time because they just weren't expecting it to form this quickly. In fact, the National Hurricane Center a couple of days ago had lowered the risk of this forming down to 30% beyond day 2 and had a near 0% chance of it developing before Monday morning. And as you can see, that was a very unfortunately bad forecast, and we all get them wrong sometimes. But they were not prepared to send a plane down yesterday as the storm was forming, and today they hurried up their flight schedule, sped it up a little bit, and got in this morning. There's another flight moving in now that is probably indicating that we have a hurricane, or at least very close to hurricane strength. The other bone I do have to pick with the Hurricane Center, and I don't want to pick on them too much, but they were concerned about this not developing a few days ago because it was going to be attached to a front or potentially subtropical. And very clearly, this is a system that is going to grow very quickly and become a very powerful storm. So as you can see now, I'll come back to that in just a second, aircraft have gone through the storm, and it looks like they're picking up near hurricane force winds near the center here. In fact, you could see the flight level winds are at about 75 knots, which is 85 miles per hour. If you take a little bit of that off, that gives you wind speeds at the ground around 70 knots, which would actually be about 80 miles per hour. So it's very likely this is going to get upgraded this afternoon And I may come back to the end of the video and already see that it's a hurricane. The pressure's dropped off as well, down just below 990 millibars, and that continues to drop. It's dropped 15 millibars since this time yesterday afternoon. At least that's the estimate. And you can see that there is warming in the eye as well, and there is a decent amount of drying that's allowing this core to dry out and will likely allow it to strengthen as well. So definitely the beginning of what's going to be a pretty quick intensification phase. You can see the pressures on here have dropped off into the 987 range, so pretty close to Category 1 hurricane strength. And you can see from the earlier flight, the core has formed around the system. Until that happens, the system isn't going to strengthen quickly, but that formed here earlier today. And you can see the winds are going to generate around it and become stronger as the day wears on. But it's not a very big storm. It's actually in a favorable position to strengthen pretty quickly. Take a look at this. It doesn't look very big, but you don't want to be in the middle of it either. Where you are in the middle, you're getting hurricane force winds at this point. And Milton's going to take advantage of his small size because as a result, he's going to be more resilient to some of the ambient weather outside of the area and will be able to grow more quickly. It's kind of like I don't know if you all have little kids at home, I do, but they can run underneath you really quickly, and it's harder for a bigger person like me to keep up with them because of how quick and shifty they are. Well, the same goes for hurricanes. The system has pulled away from mainland Mexico, so it's not going to get any dry air entrainment, and it's expected to come by over the warmest portion of the southern Gulf of Mexico and avoid any kind of disruption from the actual landmass here. So you can see here wind shear is very light. It's not enough to really get into our system, and relative humidity is pretty high. And you can see here tucked away a small but likely soon to be very powerful system here that is broken off from the front, and it is broken off from this low pressure here, which is going to move across Florida at the beginning of next week. So definitely in a spot to develop at this point. And we've seen some of these little ones really turn into monsters. Beryl was also a small storm. I know this isn't really to scale, but this one deepened very quickly at a low latitude back at the end of June. I think we all remember it was ended up a Category 5 after it moved through the Windward Islands. That was a small system. Last year, Otis in October, as it hit Acapulco as a Category 5, that was also a small storm. And the smaller ones strengthen very quickly, and they can also weaken very quickly. Well, here's a look at the Hurricane Center forecast, and this storm has tracked a little farther south than the original forecast, and that brings it close enough to the north coast of the Yucatan to now have a tropical storm warning in effect. It'll be a close call, but places like Progreso are going to be under that tropical storm warning, and we have a tropical storm watch for the northeastern tip of the Yucatan, and that includes Cancun. But you can see right now, they are unlikely to get into the main track of the storm. They may just have some side effects as the system passes by to their north. The Hurricane Center has us getting to Category 2 strength by morning and Category 3 strength by tomorrow evening. In my opinion, I think they need to up their forecast, and I would not be shocked if they ended up doing that. And by Tuesday, we are probably going to see the storm peaking as a very powerful storm. They have taken it up to the high end for Category 3. I think the future forecast is going to end up going to Category 4, but we'll have to wait and see on that. And then you will see the storm's actually going to bend back to the left in response to an incoming trough, and then we'll turn to the right and make kind of a perpendicular shot right at the coast here, coming in at a 90-degree angle. And the track earlier had it just north of Clearwater, then over Tampa. Now it's shifted a little bit south towards Sarasota, and it's possible we could see it come down a little farther south towards Northport, Venice, and maybe even Cape Coral and Port Charlotte. But a few models keep it closer to Tampa. The worst case scenario would be if the storm were to track just north of Tampa Bay, coming right in this direction. You can see this distance here is not great. It's only about 40 to 50 miles. A storm going in this direction is going to pull the storm surge up into the most populated areas. But if it comes down here, then there's actually going to be an offshore flow, which will still cause problems here in Pinellas County, but maybe not quite so bad for Tampa, except in this area. It also, unfortunately, means those areas farther south in Florida that were devastated by Ian a couple years ago are going to see an increase in the impacts, basically from Naples and Marco Island on north. This area in particular, which got hit so hard, is really not in a good spot if this track holds. It could still shift. I expect that it probably will go back and forth a little bit more, but this is where we're at here due to the southward shift in the actual storm this morning, allowing our models to trend a little bit farther south. And if you're up in Ocala and Gainesville and even Jacksonville, you're still in the path. at this point. The Big Bend is just north of the path, so we're not going to see a direct impact this time. But if it tracks north, we obviously need to be more careful and more mindful of that. The Interstate 4 corridor could be in a very dangerous spot, depending on where this ends up going, as can the Space Coast and the Treasure Coast, places like Vero Beach, Sebastian, Wabasso, and even Fort Pierce, all the way down to possibly West Palm Beach and the Lake Okeechobee area. So that part we're going to still fine-tune a little bit. We also have to fine-tune the timing on this system, as there are still model differences. You can see here, our storm is going to go over the hottest portion of the southern Gulf right in here. That should allow it to strengthen significantly. It will slightly cool off before it gets to landfall. I do think this is weakening as it comes on shore, but I don't want to guarantee that yet. So if you are in West Florida, you should always prepare for a category higher, which at this point would be a 4. Even though explicitly I'm going category 3, it's something we need to be mindful of. Here's the very hot water. Our storm is breeding in 30 to 31 degrees Celsius. That's 86 to 88 Fahrenheit. Deep warm waters as well, in an area that basically avoided where Helene tracked. And because Helene moves so quickly in this direction here, she didn't take a lot of the heat source out of the water. She took some. You can kind of see some of that cooling in here. But before the storm gets to that area, it's got a big source here for above average temperature water. And October is typically a time of year that can be very warm in the Gulf of Mexico. The reason we don't typically see storms November and on is not the water temp, but the lowering jet stream. We're not yet to that point. We're still kind of at the end of summer here, if you think about it. So we're just not in that spot. The Hurricane Center crew has noticed that an eye wall has formed, suggesting that the system is ready to quickly intensify. I think that's a pretty obvious spot at this point. Given that track over the very warm waters there and low wind shear, rapid intensification is explicitly forecast. And this prediction could still be too conservative over the central Gulf. And I'm going to show you the models that indicate that, in fact, is probably true. The biggest question is going to be how strong will Milton be once it hits Florida, as the guidance is showing that the wind shear is going to be coming up, and wind shear will allow the storm to probably weaken and get some drier air to disturb the circulation. It may not be enough to keep it from being strong, but it will help at that point. And while that weakening is anticipated, that wind shear should actually help Milton to grow in size and impact bigger areas. So we're either going to have small, compact, and powerful, or we're going to have big, sloppy, and still impactful. But neither of the two really sounds desirable at this point. So that's what we're looking at. Some key messages here from Milton. Obviously, the winds we need to start preparing for as soon as Tuesday evening on the southwest coast, Tuesday night across central and south Florida, and Wednesday morning in northeastern Florida and maybe southern Georgia. And that is the arrival time. That's the earliest possible time. You can see if it's a little slower, we may push that timeline back by about 12 hours. But nonetheless, tomorrow is going to be the day where you're going to have to make your decision, because by Tuesday, I think it might end up being too late, as the weather is going to start heading downhill and people are all going to be on the roads. With this incoming storm ahead of Milton, we've got a moderate risk of flash flooding across much of central Florida, and even the northern peninsula and southeast Florida will have a tropical fetch coming in off the Atlantic, which could produce flooding in the Miami-Dade area, Fort Lauderdale, maybe even up to Palm Beach, and across that area where several million folks live. The Hurricane Center rainfall forecasts right now are generally 6 to 12 inches, a little less here near Okeechobee, and this is going to be between now and basically Thursday. And then storm surge inundation. You can see, unfortunately, the same places that had Helene are going to have storm surge. Places like Homosassa Springs, just to the west of you there. Especially true when we get down here, the Citrus Coast towards Pinellas County, and major surge flooding. This could potentially wipe out some of these bridges that cross the bay, depending on where the storm goes. But definitely St. Pete, Tampa, Oldsmar, and right along the eastern shore of the bay, coming down here into the Bradenton area. Looks like it could potentially be inundated by storm surge, depending on where this goes. Sarasota, and especially a Longboat Key right on down the coastline here, very bad, unfortunately, as the storm is going to grow in size and create a hazardous storm surge, maybe well over 8 feet, at least one level of your house, depending on where this ends up winding up. Englewood, you can see all the way down here towards Port Charlotte. We have storm surge potential here, getting up to the river as well. Crossing I-95, Punta Gorda. Again, the same places that had the storm surge flooding last week with Helene and certainly with Ian a couple years ago are at risk. So we'll be watching for that. Rapid intensification chances are still fairly high here, well above the climatological average, 3 to 8 times above the average. Wind shear stays low over the next 2 days, and relative humidity stays fairly high here, so it's in a favorable spot to strengthen. As we get closer to landfall, notice that the wind shear comes up and the sea surface temperatures come down a little bit, and we lose some of that heat content. That's what makes me think that this storm will be weakening before it makes landfall. Now, may not be a lot of weakening, but enough to hopefully drop it down at least 1 category, if not 2. But still a powerful storm expected. Now, our storm track has shifted a little bit to the south, but still has Tampa Bay very much in play here. And still several ensembles taking it down towards Naples and Fort Myers. We have fewer that are taking it up to the north of the Tampa Bay area, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. In fact, the GFS does still have it up there, and I'll show that to you in a little bit. But this is not coming up the coastline. It's not going to hammer the Carolinas here. It may produce some gusty winds and rough surf, but primarily this storm's going to bend back to the right and lose tropical characteristics between Florida and Bermuda at the end of the week. Intensity forecasts are definitely daunting. You can see here that all of our hurricane models are Cat 4 or higher, and 2 of the 5 are actually a Category 5. And these models are aggressive, yes, but they have actually not done terribly poorly. They did pretty well with Helene and Beryl. Actually, they were underdone on Beryl, if that tells you anything. And, obviously, this is going to be a serious setup here with these winds in the forecast. I'll skip past wind shear, but I did want to show you the models here. This is the Canadian model, which is speeding up a little bit now, not as strong, of course, as the hurricane models, but still, this one's our slowest model. It brings it in Thursday afternoon and evening. The GFS model is almost a day faster, but it also brings it up still to the north and west of Tampa Bay, almost up towards almost Homosassa Springs, Wednesday evening around 7, 8 o'clock. So we've got a pretty big difference between the GFS and the Canadian in timing and how far north and west it gets. Looking at the European from earlier, you can see that it is in between the two and has landfall Wednesday early in the evening. And then looking at the Icon model, you will see that the storm is strengthening and then reaching the coastline here near Sarasota and near Northport and Venice sometime during the early to mid-afternoon on Wednesday, and then moving quickly away after that. Looking at the relative humidity, you can see this storm is going to grow significantly, a small enough storm to not be impacted by this dry air that surrounds it. As it gets closer to the coast, you will see that the dry air does eventually make it in, but not a guarantee. The GFS actually does not weaken it much because it's quicker here with the landfall, and as a result doesn't feel the wind shear. And the latest run does show that, where the wind shear doesn't catch up to it until it's making landfall. This is the farthest north of the models that I've seen here with the GFS, but it is not really weakening the storm much until it makes landfall and then starts to transition to a post-tropical system. Here's the HAVS model, one of our tropical models that I think has done pretty well. It was a little strong with Helene, but I want to make a teaching point to you. With Helene, we had a much bigger storm. In fact, one of the biggest hurricanes that we've seen come up. Because of the size of the storm and the interaction with the Yucatan, there were some core changes that slowed down that initial burst of intensification. I think you all remember that it was still a tropical storm as it moved away from Mexico, then quickly intensified, but it was a bigger storm system. A smaller storm is not going to have that kind of impact from the surroundings, and as a result, this is a very powerful Category 5 hurricane just kind of tucked away over a small part of the southern Gulf. And it is showing a pressure that gets down to as low as 901 millibars, which would be a top 10 hurricane. I don't know if it gets that strong, but nonetheless, it certainly has some potential to do that. Once it reaches its peak and the wind shear starts to get in, you can kind of see in the southeast quadrant here, there is going to be some wind shear that starts to get in here by Wednesday. It will weaken. It should come up to, or come down to Category 4 and maybe eventually Category 3, and you can see that here. But this is still very dangerous for the west coast of Florida. This is almost a worst case scenario track for Bradenton and Tampa, if this is correct. Maybe Orlando and maybe for the Space Coast, and even some gusty winds on the backside. So that's the HAVS model. The HMON model is less extreme, so I'm giving you both scenarios here, but it has a strong Category 4 storm here north of the Yucatan, approaching Category 5 strength here by the time we get to Tuesday around lunchtime, with that pressure down just below 930 millibars, and then dropping more down to 924. So the HMON, which is the weakest of the models, still gets up close to Category 5. So to me, I think it's got a good shot at getting to 5. It won't be that strong when it hits Florida. At least I really hope not. But it will still be a powerful storm, probably a Category 3. Maybe if we get lucky and it slows down, it could try to sneak down to Cat 2. But regardless, don't get too caught up in that. I think you need to be more aware of the fact that it'll grow in size, and the track is going to be extremely critical into who gets the worst storm surge and who gets the worst wind from this system. So that is a look at the impact. Rain forecasts are very high with rain tonight, tomorrow, and then Milton coming in Wednesday and Thursday. We're likely going to see at least 8 inches in several locations here in Florida. The Icon model, which shows the track over Tampa Bay, has 19 inches in Tampa, 15 in Daytona, 18 in other parts of Flagler, even as much as 21 inches. That's probably about as bad as I think it could get. It also spares parts of South Florida the worst, but I don't know if that's going to be correct. Here's a look at our winds field, and you can see how powerful and how much bigger the storm will get as it makes landfall on Wednesday afternoon. You can see strong winds across northern and central Florida, even some stronger gusts. When we get into the Big Bend area, Taylor County, it's not a storm for you, I don't think, but you'll still have some tropical storm force wind, which is going to be bad. And then as we narrow down here, central Florida, you can see a pretty good area of at least 100-mile-per-hour wind gusts expected. When you get to Pinellas County and Pasco County and some of the other counties here just north of the bay. Even Orlando here, we could see wind gusts approaching hurricane strength. And in northern Florida, we may see hurricane force winds at the coast, maybe even up to coastal Georgia, and then down towards the Space Coast. First Coast and Space Coast both could see some pretty strong wind, nasty surge here on the backside of our system as it begins to transition from a hurricane into a powerful post-tropical system merging with a front. Here's a HAVS model. This is the worst case scenario, so you can see it. And you can see wind gusts over 150 miles per hour, getting up to as high as 196 miles per hour. Again, it's a model, so it could certainly be wrong, but you get the point here. It's a powerful system here over the Central Gulf. And unfortunately, it does show a little bit of mercy at the end and weaken some with 120 mile per hour wind gusts offshore, then 110. And the worst winds are actually getting closer to the Big Bend with this northerly track on the northwest side. That's important, by the way. No matter where this system goes, you're going to see it's going to go from this size over the southern Gulf to this size by the time it gets to Florida. And we may see the strongest winds well away from the center, in this case, over 100 miles away from the center. And the reason for that is the wind shear is going to allow it to grow and try to mimic Helene at the very last moment. So that's just something to keep in mind here. We may see a much bigger area that gets impacted by stronger winds than what you might imagine right now looking at this cone. All right, real quick, here's Kirk, Category 2. Here's Leslie, Category 1. Here is our next invest. You can see Kirk is starting to transition into a post-tropical system, accelerating northeast, and the remains go into northwestern France here as we get to about Tuesday into Wednesday as a weaker system. Here is Leslie, and wind shear getting into it, so I don't think it goes past Category 1 and should weaken to a tropical storm by Tuesday or Wednesday. No threat to land. It'll eventually follow Kirk. And behind our system here, I did hint at this, we may not be finished in Florida. And I can imagine that would be pretty sickening to hear. I don't know yet how it's going to evolve, but there is a storm signal here in the Western Caribbean again next week. And at this point, really just guesswork. This was yesterday's model, a weaker system. The model run after that had a more organized system heading into South Florida and the Keys, more rain where you don't need it as soon as the middle of next week. And then the GFS runs from overnight were unfortunately not looking great. With a stronger system here moving into Southwest Florida. This would be obviously something I really hope does not happen. This is next Thursday, the 17th. The run after it, very similar, a little bit farther down the coast. And we are seeing a shift eastward in today's runs this afternoon into maybe the Bahamas and maybe narrowly avoiding Florida. But again, that's multiple runs showing an organized system coming through the Northwest Caribbean and maybe taking a shot at Florida again in about 10 days. We've got a lot of time for that, so this can certainly change. Don't get too caught up in it right now because it will change, but you can see there is a storm signal here as we get to the middle of the week of the 13th or 14th. Somewhere here across the Northwest Caribbean and Southwest Florida. And obviously we need more time to study what's going to actually happen before we make a forecast, but we may not be finished. So stay tuned on that. So I hope everybody is taking this storm seriously. Thank you so much for watching. I want to check and see again if it's a hurricane. Where are we? Yep. Okay. Not surprised here. We now have an 80-mile-per-hour hurricane. That's what the data showed. And it is rapidly intensifying. So we have Hurricane Milton. And as always, I pray for everybody's safety. I thank you for your time. And if you have not subscribed, I appreciate it if you do. I am a meteorologist. This is not for my personal gain. It is to help others. This is my assignment from God. And I'm a Christian. And I give God all the glory and all the honor just to give me this assignment and ability to study science, to understand it, and to do my best to help other folks be ready. I give God all the glory. Psalm 118:24, King James Version. This is the day which the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. The world wants us to be in a complete disarray. He wants us to hate, the world wants us to hate everything, wants us to be divided. The Lord, on the other hand, expects us to rejoice and be glad, because every day is not a guarantee. You may be gone tomorrow and you just can't see that coming. But the Lord has created the earth. He has created us to take care of the earth. And he has given us joy through his son, Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. So I pray that you all continue to see the light in a dark world. And if you don't believe that, I didn't either for a very long time. And I commiserate with you, but just know that since I made the decision to be baptized and put on Christ in my life, I have seen the joy every day and the good and what can happen in a dark, dark world. I pray that you do as well. And if you have prayer requests, I'm happy to pray for you. Hope you have a blessed Sunday, and I'll be back here tomorrow. God bless you.